A warm welcome to Pascal Finette. The Vodafone Institute is very happy to host you tonight as a speaker at our AI&I event series. So, welcome to Berlin. Pascal, you've worked for global tech companies and organizations such as eBay, Mozilla, or Google.org. And now you follow your mission to change the world with technology as chair of the Entrepreneurship and Open Innovation for the Singularity University. And furthermore, you work hard to change the mindset of business leaders and organizations as co-founder of Be Radical. I'd like to talk a bit with you about the transformational shifts we currently experience in economies, societies, and politics through digital technology. So maybe let's start first with something which we increasingly observe, which we call tech skepticism as a phenomenon. And this is also grounded in data because the Vodafone Institute has recently conducted a global study, the Tech Divide, which revealed that citizens in Europe and partly in the US are much more skeptical towards digitization than Chinese or Indians. Does this match with your observations? Are the increasing concerns regarding the impact of digital technology and the power of global tech companies more widespread in Europe or the Western, let's say, industry nations? What's your take on that?
Yeah, for sure. I think over the last couple of years, there's even a term for it in Silicon Valley called the tech backlash or the techlash. And I think it's a growing concern for not just the big tech companies, like the Googles, the Facebooks, the Apples of this world, but there's a follow-on and a trickle-on effect, of course, on everyone in the industry. Comparing this on an international level, so I see it in the US, we definitely see it in Europe, where I think it was prevalent even earlier. And I think it has a lot to do with the way the society is structured and the history. Germany, for example, of course, is well known for having very strict and very strong views on privacy, coming out of a once divided and now united country with, all the stuff which went down in the former Eastern Germany. When you go into other regions, and I do a lot of business in Latin America, for example, but also when you look at China, they have a very different perspective on privacy, for example, on surveillance, on the power of the state and the willingness to let the state, surveil you for the greater good, for the benefit of the greater good. And I think that also translates down into less of a tech skepticism. Or less of a distrust towards the large corporations or corporations in general, for sure.
Yeah. And what is the root cause from your point of view? Actually, have the tech companies missed the chance really to create trust, where they're so full of themselves that they miss that their customers are already on another train there? What's your take?
It's a really interesting question. So I used to work at Mozilla, which is of course the maker of the Firefox web browser, non-profit organization. And one of the things we found at Mozilla over and over and over again is Mozilla is an institution built and codified on trust. And ultimately people didn't care all that much. Like people cared about the quality of the product, right? So Firefox was successful not because it was a more trustworthy browser than, at the time, Internet Explorer. It was a better browser. So I think that carried the tech industry for a really long time. And I think what happens is with a lot of the recent geopolitical changes we're seeing, so rise of extremism, the whole fake news, real news debate, populism in general, we're moving from a world where we used to be in a world of information scarcity to a world of information abundance, where we move much more to the extremes, where we don't have these shared experiences anymore. And all of this, I think, leads to a world where we distrust centralized organizations. So we distrust our current government institutions, which is the reason why we vote the way we vote now. We also distrust the large corporations because they kind of take a similar position, as in they control large swaths of our lives. And thus, I believe that we're moving into a world where there is a growing distrust towards these organizations. Now, again, if you compare this in the international case, like you look at something like Facebook, for example, you go to Latin America, there's nobody, calling for delete your Facebook app, which, like you hear in the US occasionally, and you hear definitely here in Europe quite a bit. You don't hear it in Latin America because people just don't care. So very different, again, very different cultural perspectives, I think.
Absolutely. Let me get back to one point you mentioned, the role of governments. So this was also an interesting finding and actually really quite shocking for us, how low the trust in governments is to manage the digitization. Not just manage them, let's say professional with a good impact, but also in the best interest of their citizens. So why are governments failing to manage digitization, or why are they perceived to fail actually? Why are they not ready for that change yet?
I believe there's a gazillion reasons for it. I mean, it starts at the root formation of how we run our democracies, right? We have 4-year election cycles in Germany, for example. In the US, we vote for federal elections on a Tuesday because back in the day when we had horses and carriages, that was the most convenient day, right? So there's a lot of like tradition in our system. Now, the world is moving so fast that a 4-year cycle, for example, doesn't seem to make a lot of sense. So that's one side. The second side is, I believe the way governmental systems are structured in the sense of like how you rise as a politician through those systems, it takes a long time. So when you look at the average bench of the US House or the US Senate or the Bundestag or Bundesrat here in Germany, I mean, the average age, I don't know what the actual average age is, but they clearly are above, let's say, 55 probably. Now, if you think about like, do you trust these people to understand the implications of modern day technology? I'm not saying that they don't. I'm just saying, like, generally speaking, it is a very old audience, and like there is a disparity here. And we saw this really interestingly in the deposition of Mark Zuckerberg, the Facebook founder in the US, where one of the senators kept asking him, and how do I send an email over WhatsApp? Right? And he was under the impression WhatsApp is an email application, right? And of course, we all know that there's quite a bit of a difference between an email and an instant messaging system, right? So I think there's a lot of reasons why probably we rightfully should assume that government doesn't really understand tech all that well.
Okay, yes, indeed. I think the government has understood themselves, or many governments, that they need expertise, and they're hiring and they're trying to hire a lot of, let's say, experts from the industry. But back to the point on how we run democracies, in particular in Western nations, could you foresee a time, maybe whatever, 10, 20, 30 years, where we increase digital participation, or if we potentially even running governments and administrations completely by algorithms?
It's a really fascinating question. So I think there needs to be a lot of things which need to be true for this to happen. In theory, as a technologist, I think there are benefits of us leveraging technology in our democratic process. So you can think about concepts which have been debated and have been implemented on small scale, like liquid democracy, which in liquid democracy, for example, I don't give my vote for a set period, let's say 4 years, to a party. Rather, I have my vote, and I can give my vote on individual issues to the people or the person I think represents that particular issue best throughout the period. So that, in theory, at least, allows me to pick an expert, I think, who is best at, waste management when we have an issue around waste management. So in theory, this seems to be a good concept. Switzerland has for a very long time a much more participatory democracy than most countries. And it seems to work somewhat well. Now, on the flip side of that, you have challenges around, we don't even trust electronic voting systems at the moment, right? They are vulnerable, there's real issues around this. Now, you can overcome this with a technology perspective. But for example, in the US, we now have a huge debate about like going back to paper ballots because we don't trust the electronic voting record, right? So you've got these like two forces fighting against each other. And then the question becomes also, how much does an establishment in a particular region, geography, country actually want that change? So you see, for example, in the US, the way the electoral system works, where you have the House and the Senate being represented by senators, where effectively, regardless how many people live in a state, like a state has a certain amount of senators that can send, meaning that in a world where we have urbanization happening, meaning in the US, for example, more and more people move away from the center of the country towards the coasts where the big cities are, you still have the same voting power. So the voting power in the Senate hasn't shifted to reflect the reality. So Now, will this change ever? Probably not, because there's such an entrenched interest to keep it that way, right? So it's a very complex system. In theory, technology can help, but I think it's much more a socio-economic question which we need to tackle.
Absolutely, and I mean the same is true for the entire debate about AI, actually, not just in Europe but across the world. So sometimes it seems to me, is this another hype, just another hype, or the next hype? And is the impact of AI on society, economy completely overrated? What's your take? How transformational is this technology, AI, machine learning, really?
Yeah, it's a really good question. I think it's overrated and it's totally underrated at the same time. The challenge is that we look at AI today, and the systems we have today, the technologies we're using, the algorithms we have developed, they're already really good at very specific use cases. And in those, they have started literally change the world. Very simple example, we now have an AI which can look at melanoma, which is skin cancer, and outperforms 136 out of 157 world-class dermatologists. Right, so you should actually trust that AI more than you trust your dermatologist. Now that is easy for an AI because it is a very specific use case for an AI which it has been trained very well on, which is basically image recognition or pattern recognition. There's a gazillion other use cases where AI is just not really good at. So in those cases, AI will not change anything until we developed probably completely new ways of thinking about AI. So all that being said, at the same time, we see still increasing capabilities of compute power. It gets all much cheaper. We get more connected. 5G, for example, is a good driver here, a driving force here. So AI is the way to think about AI. Is you might have heard this. Like a lot of people say this. Like AI is the new electricity. So AI is not a means in itself. It's an enabler to solve certain questions. And it does so probably better than humans in some cases today, in many cases tomorrow. So it will be very transformative. But at the moment, there's still a lot of hype in there, for sure.
Yeah. Let's look a little bit ahead with regards to the grand challenges of humanity. I mean, we've got 36 degrees currently in Berlin. You talked about the heat wave in San Francisco. Obviously, climate change has arrived already. So how can AI potentially help to solve a challenge like climate change or other, let's say, big challenges of humanity?
Well, I think generally speaking, what we call exponentially accelerating technologies, at Singularity we dub them this way, so anything from AI to advances in computing, robotics, synthetic biology, so genetics, the advances we're making in energy, in the energy transformation, etc. I think they all can be leveraged to tackle some of these really big problems, which quite frankly, a lot of them are relatively incomprehensible to us because they're so complex, there's such a strong systems component to them where there's so much interplay that we actually need to leverage every ounce of technology we have to better understand them, to figure out like what are the levers we can pull to make this change happen. Now, the important thing, again, like for me, the important thing to mention here is none of that will happen if humans aren't making that decision. Right? So climate change is not being solved by a computer, ever. It's solved by a human who makes a choice to like change it, attack the problem. So I think we need to be very careful to not fall into the fallacy of using technology as the cop-out, as technology will solve the problem. Yeah. It is not. Like humans with technology will solve the problem.
Absolutely. So first there might be the need for behavior change, actually. Yeah, and on the negative side, because there has a lot of conversation been around AI and, for example, the changes on the labor market, and you talked a lot about this. So what do you see as the potential, let's say, highest negative impacts or collateral damage which could happen with AI, which we need to focus on now?
Yeah, I think it's a really good question. I think it's again, like you need to zoom out a little bit, I think, where we need to be aware of the fact that there are certain classes of professions, certain classes of tasks, which machines can do and will do better. And it's not the first time we went through this, right? Like Industrial Revolution taught us this, where like we started manufacturing stuff with machines instead of with our hands. The difference here is that it might come faster than it did prior, right? So the adoption time for technology to hit the market and then basically become widespread and being used has become reduced. So I think we need to really think about how do we create new opportunities, upskilling, reskilling for the labor market. But also, if you think about what we call K-12 in the US, so kindergarten till 12th grade education, so Abitur in Germany, we need to figure out like what do we actually teach kids to be successful in this new world. And I would make the argument we're falling pretty short on that side, as well as, of course, the labor market itself. So I think there's a really interesting and really important discussion to be had, and less, in more practical terms than we're currently doing it. I think there's a lot of like debate about, oh my God, you know, whatever the number is you read, like 20% of jobs will go away, 80% of jobs will go away, right? But really thinking about like, okay, so what does it actually mean? Where does it really happen, and what do we do about this?
Yeah, I mean, the good thing about this entire debate on AI and the impact on the labor market will be that we finally will start to move on, right? And really change the educational system and really take lifelong learning seriously. So there needs to be some pressure on society, I think, to change this. So let's take a bit more of a macro perspective, actually. One topic which gets a lot of attention currently is the kind of fierce competition, or increasingly fierce competition, between the US and China mainly regarding global technology leadership, in particular when it comes to AI, right? So do we need to be actually concerned in Europe from your point of view, and maybe also a little bit in the US? Yeah. So it seems that like the old world order is turning upside down, because the Chinese are so tenacious and they seem to be so effective on how they deploy these technologies, advance them, how they go to market with these technologies, and they are not hampered, so to say, by ethical debates like we are in Europe. What's your point of view? Because you see the US, you see Asia. Is this true, or is this?
Yeah, I think there is, generally speaking, there's some data which shows you, for example, that the US in 2018 spent about $25 billion on AI research. China spent about $30 billion on AI research, and this is basic research. And all of Europe combined spent $3 billion. So there clearly is a divide here, and it clearly has become a two-horse race at the moment, at least. Now, I believe that given the political system of the US versus China, the kinds of AI, the kinds of use cases at least, and probably also the kind of basic research, the directional position of this basic research is different. So yes, China, for example, has famously, surely less a concern about data privacy, but also the products Chinese consumers use and are built for Chinese consumers typically don't work all that well in Western markets. So a good example is if you look at WeChat, their chat application, which is basically it's your life in your phone, basically. It does everything, like payments and God knows what else. WeChat doesn't really play a role outside of China, right? For good reason, because it's a foreign object to us, again, in the cultural context. So I think there's differences here, and that also leads to differences in the way AI is being developed and deployed. Now you can level this up and basically look at, for example, cybersecurity, and you might have heard the US is currently boasting that they have infiltrated the Russian electric grid. We know that the US electric grid has been or we believe that the US electric grid has been infiltrated. So there's a whole new world out there in terms of, securing like kind of the warfare. So the idea of like how do I actually secure my infrastructure, et cetera, which that is also driven by AI, right? A lot of these systems are AI-based infiltration systems. So it's an interesting complex world.
Absolutely, and I think it's too early to have an answer on that question. Actually, who will win the race, right? It's not a zero-sum game, actually. So, but one question related to this is there was a lot of discussions, in particular in the European Union, on human-centric AI, and that was also pretty successfully, let's say, directed also by large tech companies, right? Who kind of, let's say, also invented this concept of human-centric AI. Do you think that last but not least, on the mid or long run, Europe will have a competitive advantage, so to say, because they ground AI or other technology developments based on human rights and European values?
Yeah, it's a really good question. I don't know, actually. So if you would have asked me about a year ago how GDPR plays out, so the German or the European Data Privacy Directive, I would have said that Europe basically shot themselves in the foot with it because it prevents them from doing a lot of things which are totally doable in the US and China. Now, what happened is, what's actually interesting is that it has shifted behavior of companies outside of the European Union in terms of how they develop their products, because then, for better or worse, they need to be compliant with GDPR. So they shape, at least in certain areas, they shape their behavior. This might happen with AI as well. Now, the question becomes, does it give Europe an actual advantage, or does Europe just become the holy grail, you know, like the holy mountain of like the gatekeeper and tries to influence, which, you know, in itself is a valuable position. I'm not sure how much it drives economic growth in the region, right? So I would probably assume it's a similar situation where, yes, Europe might influence, and at the same time, I'm not sure if it leads to economic advantages.
Yeah, that's a very interesting perspective, because we might ending to be the moral leader, but not the technology and, let's say, industry leader anymore. Yeah, so looking a little bit more ahead in the future, because this is a key driver of your work actually, what do you think, how will AI have changed the world in 2030? It's not long ago, it's actually just 10 years, but for this kind of technology, it's a lot, right? So what's your personal utopia or dystopia, actually?
It's a really good question. So I believe you will, first of all, you will see AI becoming pretty ubiquitous in a lot of the services and the products you use, but you will probably not necessarily even think about those, right? So for me, a good example is something like the Nest thermostat. So it's basically a thermostat which allows you to like dial up and dial down the temperature, but it has a little bit of basic AI, which it learns, you know, when do you like actually switch on the lights or turn up the heat or turn down the heat. Now, we will see many, many more devices which get this level of like just intelligence, basic intelligence. So that will happen. I think we will see one of the things which really frightens me is when you see the quality of what is called deep fakes. So this is AI basically generating anything from fake video, fake audio, fake text. It's already pretty good. If you extrapolate this out 10 years, I think you will have a world where we will have this interview where I didn't actually give you that interview. I think that's very dystopian for me, because it means that you cannot trust the printed or the listened to or the seen word, which is really like disturbing if you think about like how our democracies function, right? And then lastly, I think the big challenge I think in AI at the moment is particularly the newer forms of AI, so deep learning AIs, neural networks, etc. They're effectively black boxes, so you can't pry them open. You kind of don't really know why they're making their decisions. And I think we need to get to a world where we can actually start to do introspection on those, because we will not trust them otherwise. Like, even if the result is accurate, there's still a trust gap here if you can't pry them open. And there's efforts to like build systems which allow you to understand this better, but I think that's a huge issue and we need to fix that. And if we haven't fixed it in 10 years, I think the trajectory for AI will be very different, just from a trust perspective.
Absolutely. So thank you very much. That was super interesting, and I hope we will have the next interview not as an avatar driven by an algorithm, but definitely again in person. Thank you very much, Pascal.
Thank you for having me.